I'm Connor Rebush, and if you are interested in the finer points of face punching, you've come to the right place. This is Heavy Hands. Happy May, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Heavy Hands. I am your host, Connor Rebush, joined once again, as always, by co-host Patrick Wyman. And today, we are going to talk to you about the very best fights featured on UFC Rotterdam. Now that I've said that, you know, of course, I mean fights such as Bigfoot Silva versus Stefan Struve, and Nikita Krylov versus Frankomir Barroso. You know, all the best ones, right, Pat?
Jermaine Durandamy versus Anna Elmos, 3 of She professional fights.
Yeah, absolutely. Nick Hine versus John Tuck, all the good ones. I feel slightly guilty now. I imagine that there's someone listening to this who is not a dork for mixed martial arts, and they were just getting really excited about all these strange and exotic sounding names, thinking, "Oh, these must be these must be great fighters. These must be really good matchups. I can't wait to hear about this." I'm sorry. I'm ashamed to admit that I was lying. We do have a few fights that are truly interesting that we are going to talk about today, though. Those being Alistair Overeem versus Andrei Arlovsky, great heavyweight matchup in the main event. After that, we're going to talk about Kyoji Horiguchi and Neil Seery, 2 of the most action-packed, fun, exciting flyweights around. And then in our second segment, we're going to go in-depth on Albert Einstein Tumenov versus Gunnar Nelson, which both Pat and I agree is pretty much the greatest fight on this card. 2 really talented, finish-focused fighters. We both love Albert Tumenov in particular, so that one should be a blast. And, apologies, by the way, to those of you who were expecting this episode to be an interview with Mark Henry. That's the coach of Edson Barboza, Frankie Edgar. I think he coaches Chris Weidman and Marlon Moraes, among others. We ran into some scheduling difficulties, so we are going to try, and don't hold us to this, but this is our plan. We're going to talk about UFC Rotterdam today in a fairly short episode, and then we're going to try to have a second episode this week in which we will have the members of the UFC 197 Winners Circle joining us, those being Brandon Gibson, the coach of John Jones, who beat Ovince St. Preux at UFC 197, and the aforementioned Mark Henry, who led Edson Barboza to his best career victory to date. So we're looking forward to that. Apologies for the confusion, but that should be good. Pat, let's go ahead and talk about some heavyweights. We've got Overeem, Arlovsky. Hopefully we can get some more from Mr. Gibson on this as well, because both of these guys are teammates, both Jackson Winklejohn fighters, which is an interesting dynamic.
Well, so it's an interesting dynamic between them. So when I was there in November, these guys, they never trained together in the time that they spent, in the time that they were both at Jackson Winklejohn, even when they both had fights coming up in the near future.
Which seems weird. You'd think you would want them as a training partner, as a fellow heavyweight.
I'm sorry?
You'd think that either man would want the other as a training partner, as a heavyweight. It's hard to find better training partners than a guy like this.
Yeah, you might think so, but apparently they had kind of they were like two guys eyeing each other. Like they were always sizing each other up, like they knew this fight was going to come at some point. It was like a very tension-filled and kind of awkward vibe that even I picked up on. I can't imagine what it's like if you're in that gym all the time and you had to see them, like prepping for each other that way, you know. But like Maximus Arlovsky's adorable dog, he was like staring at Overeem with undisguised dislike in his eyes. So take that as you will.
Unsubtle Contempt. New nicknames. We've got Andre Unsubtle Contempt Arlovsky and Alistair Side-Eye Overeem.
Well, they would eyeball each other as they were warming up, like as they were getting drills ready. Like whenever one of them walked in, the other would stare him down, like mad dog him, you know.
Weird.
Like it was a really weird dynamic.
How long has this fight been in the works? I mean, I guess hearing that, it's not a surprise to see that these two guys are agreeing to fight each other. It seems like they've been gearing up for that since the day Alistair Overeem came to the gym.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know what the deal is, but like they very much seem like this was always something that they thought was going to happen, and both of them were ready and happy for it.
Interesting. Well, I have heard that it will be Andrei Arlovsky's corner that will have Greg Jackson, presumably Brandon Gibson and or Mike Winklejohn in the corner.
I don't think Gibson will. I don't think Gibson will be there because I doubt we would be interviewing him this week if he were going to Rotterdam.
Oh, that's a good point. So then I assume it will be Jackson and Winklejohn in the corner of Andrei Arlovsky. Do you know, having been there and seen the two in training, do you know what the rest of Andrei Arlovsky, Alistair Overeem's coaching staff looks like?
Overeem has always had his own guys that he works with, but I'm not sure who he's working with right now. I'm gonna take a look at some of the usual sources to see if I can figure out where Overeem's been training.
Okay, yeah. So it's an interesting dynamic. Stylistically, I think it's a pretty fascinating fight. We have two guys who, based on their attributes, are very similar. Two hard-hitting fighters. Both of them these days have fallen into a little bit more cautious outfighting or counterpunching style, when both of them used to be a lot more aggressive. Both powerful punches, as I said, both not exactly known for having granite chins. The quality of both men's chins has probably been, I don't know, not as bad as it seemed in the past.
But
this is heavyweight,
Yeah,
they have human chins in a division that demands something greater for true consistency. So that's their greatest flaw.
So it looks like they have actually both been training at Jackson Winklejohn for this fight.
Ooh, I can imagine the tension has only gotten more interesting.
Yeah, so it looks like Overeem is going to have. I think Overeem has his own striking coach, and then it looks like he'll probably have their jiu-jitsu coach maybe in his corner.
Weird, man.
Yeah, it's a strange dynamic. I can't imagine what that would look like, and it wouldn't work, I don't think, at a gym that didn't have that wasn't that big and that well equipped.
Yeah,
and they have two full-sized UFC cages in there, so you can have different people in there working at different times. It's a nice setup.
Well, it should alleviate any fears that this might be, as fights between training partners often are, a glorified sparring match, because it seems like there's some real animosity or mistrust or something between these two guys.
No.
So,
I'll be honest. I don't think it's hard for most people to come up with some animosity toward Alistair Overeem.
Yeah, he's hopped around from gym to gym a lot in his life. He's gained a lot of enemies, or at least people who will have some bad things to say about him in the aftermath. You get the sense that he likes his camp to be built around him, and he has no problem jumping ship when things aren't working out for him. He doesn't have that sense of loyalty, I don't think. Which isn't necessarily a bad thing for him. Like, for example, I don't think he would have developed the way he has in the last 2 years if he had stayed with Henry Hooft.
Yeah.
Bas Rutten's no longer friends with him, but Bas Rutten probably doesn't know as much as he thinks he does about modern MMA. So
I don't think anybody who listens to the show is going to be in much doubt about that.
Right.
So I remember, I talked to Brandon Gibson about this, the first conversation that we ever had about Overeem and what he was getting at Jackson Winklejohn that he hadn't been getting at the Black Zillions. And he said the biggest thing, and I think this speaks to Overeem's transformation in the last couple of years, which is why I bring this up. Overeem knows how to throw a 2-3 low kick, he's been doing that for years. He doesn't need the kind of intense one-on-one drilling sessions that you're going to get if Henry Hooft is your striking coach. He just doesn't need that anymore. He's been doing that since he was 17 years old. That doesn't improve Alistair Overeem at this point anymore. What he needed were coaches who could take the skills that he had built over the years, all of these wonderful, amazing, diverse skills that Overeem has, and put them to use in creative ways. And that, to me, is how Overeem has transformed himself. He needed to adapt to being a guy who couldn't just march you down anymore after he lost 30 pounds. I don't know why he lost 30 pounds. Speculate. You
don't know why?
On that front.
You won't say why.
I won't say why. I'll say, install your own explanation for that here. But he couldn't be that guy anymore. He couldn't take the punches that he used to take. He needed to do something different. And so they took a guy who has always had an exceptional understanding of space and distance, who has always been quick and light on his feet, who has an incredibly long reach, who knows how to get in and out of range, and said, okay, well, now you're going to be a stick and move out fighter. And crazily enough, Overeem has all the tools to make that work at an exceptionally high level.
And he's done it with some great success before this. His fight with Bigfoot Silva comes to mind. He fought from range. He picked his shots. He just got a little too cocky, perhaps, at certain points in that fight. And also, I think he just got clipped. He seemed to be doing okay before Bigfoot Silva just kind of went all Tim Boach on him and went nuts and finished him in the third round. But we've seen him in the past kind of fall into that style. It gives sort of the impression that it's a style he would like to use. And I think in addition to his intense focus on basics, I don't think that's necessarily Henry Hooft's biggest problem as a coach. From what I've been able to gather, I think his biggest problem as a coach is perhaps a lack of flexibility. Not just with the kinds of techniques he teaches, but the kinds of fighters he likes to produce. I think he likes aggressive fighters who throw Dutch-style combinations and come forward, or who defend and then counter and stay in the pocket. And I don't get the sense that Henry Hooft would have been advocating for Andrei Arlovski to do what he has now been doing with a great deal of success for his last 3 fights.
You mean with what Overeem has been doing for his last 3 fights?
Overeem. Do I keep calling him Arlovski?
That was the only time.
Okay, good.
No, I mean, I think that's true. I think you're absolutely right to point to a lack of flexibility. That there seems to be a one-size-fits-all approach, and that is, I would say, a great weakness of the Dutch style in general.
Sure.
I think that it is a pretty modular approach. That it varies a lot from coach to coach and gym to gym what they want to teach. But if you're a Mike Passanier fighter, you're in there learning the same combination from Monday to Friday. If you're a Henry Hooft student, you are drilling the same combinations over and over and over again. And they're effective combinations. They work really well. You're learning good basics. You're learning all the stuff you need to learn. But those, I think, in MMA, when you have a lot more potential variables involved, you need a little more flexibility. You need it to be a little more modular.
Yeah, I think even in kickboxing you could stand to have it. I mean, Artem Levin is like a damn revolutionary by kickboxing standards. He's not even that amazing of a counterpuncher and outfighter in terms, he doesn't have this massive pool of techniques from which he draws. He just fights in a style that suits him. And you don't see a lot of that. I think it's very difficult to climb to the top of the Dutch kickboxing hill using just a Dutch kickboxing style. And even a guy like Stephen Wright, the Warman, who's been on our show a couple times, he from a Dutch kickboxing background, does not teach strict Dutch kickboxing to his fighters. We see a lot of those combinations from Johnny Hendricks, but we also see a lot of good movement and use of the jab at range and counterpunching. I think the Dutch kickboxing often ends up with a lot of limitations, not just in the kinds of techniques you throw, but in the triggers off of which you throw them, the kind of movement you feel that you're allowed to use. The context in which you put those techniques is pretty small. And Henry Hooft produces fighters who are very good Dutch kickboxers, but even as Ubereem, Alistair Overeem was not that great at taking a shot. You know what I mean? He's always had a bit of a suspect chin, or at least he's also had in the past, I think, a bit of a bully mentality, where he's had issues with coming back from taking that first big shot, where a lot of fighters would be staggered. Overeem is staggered and also loses his confidence, and so he can't recover as well as other fighters have. We've seen him turn his back when he fought Chuck Liddell. We've seen a lot of examples of this happening to Overeem, and so I think
he basically folded when he fought Shogun.
Right, yeah. He has had a lot of these situations where he got tired or he got hurt, and he just didn't really have the guts to fight through it. I think, and we may have mentioned this before, but I think maybe teaching him to be a high-volume, aggressive, in-your-face Dutch kickboxer actually works against him, because if he doesn't get you out of there in the first round, now he's tired, now he's absorbed some counters, and now his confidence is starting to wane. If you're trying to either fix or at the very least hide the issues that he seems to have with insecurity or with confidence, then you should allow him to feel good for 3 to 5 rounds straight. You should allow him to retain his stamina. You should allow him to pick his shots and let the other person learn to respect his power, and therefore you'll let him retain his confidence. You know what I mean?
Yeah, so building off that, this kind of in and out stick and move style that he's adopted, where he uses these rangy kicks, especially oblique kicks and side kicks to the thigh, to set his preferred distance, and then he can pick his spots to say, okay, I'm gonna stop here and I'm gonna throw a nice body kick, I'm gonna throw a nice low kick, or okay, now I'm gonna throw a shifting straight left or straight right. When he's in that situation, I think it suits him psychologically because he's the one who dictates the term of the engagement there, right? We've talked before about outfighters wanting to be the kinds of people who are always fighting from the high ground. And I think that just is Alistair Overeem.
Yeah, I think that like a bully mentality kind of suits an outfighter better than it does a pressure fighter. Because if
Absolutely.
the other person is not easy to bully, is not easy to overwhelm, then you end up defeating yourself trying to pressure them or swarm them. Whereas if they are not easy to overwhelm, you can still pick them apart and retain your confidence. If you have it in your mind that your goal is not to destroy them in 3 minutes, but to outclass them and make them look silly from long range, then you will feel you are accomplishing your goal even if you never hurt them once.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. Like, you could see, despite not doing a whole lot against Junior Dos Santos in the first round, like, it didn't crack Overeem's confidence.
No.
Like, he thought, oh, okay, I've done more or less what I want to do. I probably kind of won that round, but no need to do anything silly here. Let's just stick to the game plan.
Yeah, and he's still, the same Alistair Overeem in some regards. I think it was probably the same Overeem against Ben Rothwell, more or less, because he put in the same kind of performance against Frank Mir, a rangy kickboxing, outfighter performance. And, Rothwell still managed to tag him, and I have no doubt that will happen. That's in part what makes this matchup so interesting, but I think I'm going to go ahead and wager, I'm going to make a guess, that you, like me, favor Alistair Overeem in this matchup because of that variety and because of how much more comfortable he's gotten in a distance that actually suits his mentality.
That is, it's like you just stole a line from my preview right there, Connor. Like, what defines this matchup is either fighter's ability to end it at any point, right?
Yes.
But what makes this
or
not
to be put away. Like, both guys can hit hard, both guys are great finishers, and both guys are relatively easy to finish by heavyweight standards. So it's a risky... Go on.
Yeah, exactly. But what makes it not a coin flip, despite either fighter's ability to finish the fight at any time, is the fact that Overeem is so much better at establishing the distance he wants to fight at. Yeah. He's so much better at getting in and out, and he has so many more tools. Like, Arlovsky has a really pared down kind of veteran game at this point. He's basically a right hand, which he likes to lever punch with, and then diving into the clinch. That's really his bread and butter. That's what he does, and it more or less works in the context that he wants it to. He's got a lot of ways of putting his right hand on your chin, but he's not going to be out there repeatedly throwing oblique kicks to your thigh or setting a distance or sticking and moving. His jab makes occasional appearances, but not a lot.
Yeah.
He's as likely to throw a back fist after throwing a right hand as he is to follow with a left hook.
I think he's more likely to follow with a back fist. Arlovsky's never had much of a left hook. Yeah, and it's he may be a little more comfortable in the pocket than Overeem, but the problem is that, I mean, if you look at the kinds of guys these guys have beaten, Arlovsky, I think, has always been able to rely on his quickness. He's still a very fast heavyweight, despite the fact that he's been doing this for a long time, and he's 37 years old now. He's older than I thought. He's still a very fast, explosive heavyweight. He can cover distance really rapidly, and most of his most impressive wins were against guys who were more typical heavyweights. Larger and substantially slower, and often not as comfortable in the striking department. And that is not Alistair Overeem. Overeem, especially the slimmer, more light-footed version of Overeem, is a very different kind of heavyweight from most. And if we compare opponents, I know MMA math is silly, but I'd say Junior Dos Santos is a lot more like Andrei Arlovsky than, I don't know, Travis Brown is like Alistair Overeem. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, it just strikes me that, like, yeah, could Arlovsky land a knockout punch? Absolutely.
No doubt.
But I think if Overeem doesn't, he's not screwed in a way that Arlovsky is if he doesn't. Like, I think Overeem can score points. I think he's going to be happy to be patient and stick and move, land the strikes that he wants to land. And if that knockout blow doesn't come, I think he will have scored enough to win a decision.
Yeah, I generally have the same feeling. We've got just a couple minutes left in this segment, so let's do a very quick discussion of the flyweight matchup in this card. It always pleases me to see an exciting flyweight matchup, one that is not just interesting to me as a weirdo who likes the flyweight division, but one that actually promises to be a fun fight. I don't think Neil Seery's been in a boring fight since he came to the UFC. And Kyoji Horiguchi, I guess people might say his most boring fight was when he was patiently picked apart by Demetrius Johnson, which was a pleasure to watch in its own way. And so we have this interesting matchup. This, you and I both agree, is definitely the kind of fight that Horiguchi, in a perfect world, would have been getting in lieu of a fight with the champion and arguable pound-for-pound best fighter in the sport. A 6 year, I think he has 6 years of experience. He's right around the point where, had he not been had his doors blown off by Demetrius Johnson, now he could start stepping it up. Instead, he's had to take that hard loss and go back. But fortunately, he looked pretty solid in that fight with Chico Camus. I think that was kind of a show-me fight for you, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was. And now I'm sold. I was not sold on Horiguchi up until the after the Demetrius Johnson fight, because I saw the talent. I wasn't sure that I saw the continuous improvements.
Sure.
But now, yeah, I'm there. I'm there on Horiguchi, and if he goes out and he does what he's supposed to do to Neil Seery, then I'll be fully sold on him. But yeah, this is in a division that's as thin as flyweight is. You don't young guys like Horiguchi with that kind of talent don't get the time to develop the way they would at welterweight or at welterweight or lightweight or any division where there's some margin of
same thing will almost certainly end up happening to Corey Anderson at light heavyweight.
Yeah, assuming Corey Anderson beats Shogun, as I'm sure he would, he'll be slotted into a top contender matchup.
He'll be fighting Alexander Gustafsson or some shit within the year.
Yeah, there's just no time for guys in these divisions to develop properly. Even Chris Weidman at middleweight did not get a whole lot of opportunities to develop. It's a miracle that he didn't get his confidence destroyed before then.
Mark Munoz to Anderson Silva is a hell of a step up.
Yeah, exactly. But with Horiguchi, now that he's been taken down 14 times by Demetrius Johnson and finished in the 5th round, now he gets the chance to get the fights that he should have gotten beforehand. And if he's got the kind of mental makeup that we think he does, he will come back from that and be better, as he was against Chico Camus. And Seery's a really good fighter. I love Neil Seery. He's one of my favorite guys to watch. He's functional at everything he does. He's tricky. He's smart. He adapts well over the course of the fight. He's clearly well prepared every fight that he has. He knows what he's dealing with, and he plans his training accordingly. He's a fun boxer. He's a good counterpuncher, which could give Horiguchi problems if Horiguchi's not getting in and out on different angles, if he's not moving his head, all of that. He's a tricky takedown artist. If Horiguchi, again, if Horiguchi is not on his A game, Neil Seery will find ways to make him pay for it.
And Horiguchi does tend to rely on timing more than actual defensive prowess or excellent positioning in the pocket. He relies on the fact that you can't time him to counter him rather than making himself uncounterable as he attacks. You know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely.
So he will be there to be hit, and Neil Seery is good at that. I think the biggest thing for Neil Seery in this fight that makes him a more interesting, he doesn't have the same counter wrestling as Chico Camus, and I think that'll probably be an ace up Horiguchi's sleeve. But the thing that makes Seery interesting, as long as Horiguchi doesn't just repeatedly take him down, or after Seery adapts to that, because he's a very smart, adjustable fighter, is the fact that Seery is a very, very game fighter. Seery is the kind of fighter who, Rafael dos Anjos has this trait. Do you remember when Rafael dos Anjos fought Ben Henderson, and Ben Henderson hit him with that sort of trademark right hook to the body? Mm-hmm. And 3 seconds went by, and dos Anjos immediately went and threw the exact same shot and landed it, and then followed it with this thudding leg kick for good measure.
Yep, I do recall that.
Neil Seery has that. If you hit him with something, he's going to hit you back with the same thing twice as hard and follow it up with 2 more strikes. And so I think it's going to be a difficult fight for Horiguchi to actually end up taking over on the feet, because Seery is very good at finding ways to match you when you start to hurt him, and he's very difficult to actually put away. So I love this matchup.
Yeah, Seery is a tricky, crafty fighter, and he's durable. And he's going to be there. He's not going to fold. He's not as athletically gifted as a guy like Chico Camus is, but he is a much better thinker in the fight. Mm-hmm. And that tests Horiguchi in different ways. But that's the whole point of fights like this, is now that Horiguchi, who got a title shot off of beating Louis freaking Gaudino. Now that we've seen now that he's had that loss, now Horiguchi is getting the kinds of matchups that test him in interesting ways
and allow him to make developments. Like fighting Demetrius Johnson, that's not the time when you're going to come out and say, "All right, I've been working on all these new things. Let's try it out." These are the kind of fights where you can afford to do that, and where you're still at a good enough level, at which Horiguchi is, that you can fall back on your A game to win. But he can come in here and test things. He can test drive a few new techniques or a different style of fighting. So, yeah, I like it. Another interesting note before we wrap up. Neil Seery's never been actually KO'd. Horiguchi's probably the hardest hitter in the flyweight division now that John Dodson's no longer there. And yet, Siri once had a knee injury, but he's very difficult to finish. So I think that right there makes this a really fascinating fight because Horiguchi has relied on his fight-ending power to change a lot of opponents' minds. And I think Neil Siri's got utmost confidence in a chin that has not yet failed him. So, interesting matchup, very fun. Next up, after this break, we're going to be talking about Albert Tumenov versus Gunnar Nelson, and then hopefully a little bit of a topic discussion after that. Hey everybody, thanks for listening to this week's Heavy Hands. If you like what you hear, please consider pledging to support the podcast on Patreon. Patreon is basically continuous crowdfunding. You sign up to contribute a certain amount per month to help us with production costs and the like, and in return you get rewards ranging from a mention on the Heavy Hands website to a question or topic of your choice being discussed on the show. We have a lot more in the works to reward you for your help, and we appreciate every contribution. No amount is too small. Just head over to patreon.com and find how you can help out the only show dedicated to the finer points of face punching. Now let's get back to it. And a quick note before I move on, I want to thank all of our Patreon patrons who pledged $3 or more to Heavy Hands on Patreon for the month of April. Those people for this week's episode are Angel or Angel Jambazov, Mark Guagenti, Matt Giordano, Ricky, Thaddeus Pryor, and Ben Cohn. Thank you very much, guys. A special note, too, to all of our $5 and up patrons. If you have a question or if you donated $20 per month, a topic suggestion for us, even if you've already sent one in, now's about the time to roll it over and send us another one so we can answer more of your fascinating questions. Thank you guys for your support, and back to the show. And we are back. We're going to be discussing something right now, Pat. The question of this segment, as you just put it to me. Would you mind repeating what you just asked me?
Well, I think the real question here is whether Gunnar Nelson can beat Tumenov. That's super juvenile. Super juvenile. But I'm okay with it.
Oh, can he jack Tumenov style?
Yeah, well, I think we'll find out. I think we will. Though we may need to wait until the dressing room to really find out. So that's terrible. That is, God, are we 12? Are we 12, Connor? What's happened here?
This is the world of MMA, my friends. Just embrace it. Now, we both agree this is the best fight on the card. But is it really the most competitive matchup, or is it just have our favorite fighter in it? You know what I mean?
Yeah, I mean, I think it is. I think it is the most layered matchup on the card in terms of how these two fighters match up with each other. Like it is, I think it is literally the best matchup. I think it's the most complex. I think these two guys have the most going on. The chin factor in Arlovsky Overeem means that there are a bunch of variables, but I think these are the two highest level fighters in their division who are still who still have long careers ahead of them, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm. Like Overeem and Arlovsky are basically fighting for their last title shot. Like Tumenov and Nelson still have 7 or 8 years of being really good fighters ahead of them. 6 or 7 years.
Yeah, this is that fight where it's more like chess than speed chess. You know what I mean? The speed chess fights are where you have the element of pressure, you have all of the randomness that pressure causes that affects the strategy, and so the random X factor elements of the chins and the power and things like that. These are two guys who are durable and confident in their styles. They know where their strengths lie, and so we're not going to have it's difficult to imagine Tumenov just blowing Gunnar Nelson out of the water with a first round KO, and it's difficult to imagine Gunnar Nelson easily getting Tumenov down and working him on the ground. So both of these guys, they have their clear strategic aims, but they have balanced enough games that they can fight intelligently to make those come about.
Yeah, well, I mean, it speaks to the differing depths of talent that you have at heavyweight versus welterweight, right? Tumenov and Nelson are somewhere between the 15th and 20th best welterweights in the UFC by consensus, somewhere in there. Overeem and Arlovsky are veterans who have had literally decades to add pieces to their game. They're top 6 or 7 heavyweights. Mm-hmm. And Tumenov Nelson is a more compelling technical matchup.
Oh my God, Tumenov's a year younger than me.
Dude, Tumanov is a baby. He is a young man.
24? I was just thinking because of your remark there that I would compare their ages in this matchup to the ages of Overeem and Arlovsky, both in their
37
mid
and
to late
36.
30s. Yeah, 24 is younger than I expected, though.
Yeah, Tumanov is a young man. But
Yeah.
at any rate, as far as the matchup itself is concerned, what really stands out to you here, Connor? Like, what do you think are the major factors that we need to be looking at?
I think Albert Tumanov is his greatest strength in this matchup because as a pure grappler, he doesn't want to play with Gunnar Nelson on the ground. Gunnar Nelson has his clear areas of dominance, his clear strengths in this fight. But I think that Albert Tumanov has the most marked advantage over Gunnar Nelson, which is that he is a process-driven fighter. He knows how to approach a fight with a game plan in mind, and though he's not rigidly adhering to it, and he is flexible, he does things that suit his game plan. He doesn't attack every opening he sees or wait for the perfect opening. He does things to bring about a sort of preordained idea of what the best way to fight this given opponent is. And Gunnar Nelson is kind of famously anti that. They talked so much, and it sounds so great, but he and John Kavanagh talked so much before that Rick Story fight about how they don't have game plans. They're style without style, and all of these like Bruce Lee sounding quotes and things like that.
That is such a crock of horse shit.
Yeah, it's like it's some kind of ideal to approach that you shouldn't have to plan or change things up for an opponent or whatever. And if you can do it, that is pretty amazing, I guess. But to look at it as an ideal way of preparing is silly because it, like in that fight, it bit Gunnar Nelson in the ass and
repeatedly, over and over, and broke his nose and got his legs busted to hell and got him soundly shit kicked by a talented but limited fighter.
Yeah, absolutely. He was knocked down. Like Rick Story is one of the most, I was going to say mediocre, which is a horrible word to use. He's one of the most like middle of the road workman-like fighters in the UFC. I love Rick Story's style. I love what he does with the tools he has, but he's not particularly powerful. He's not particularly fast, either with his hands or on his feet. In terms of given talents, he's not as blessed as Gunnar Nelson. You know, he's not equipped with the same kinds of natural-born talents as Gunnar Nelson, but he knew how to use what he had, and Gunnar Nelson didn't. Like Gunnar Nelson had a very difficult time adjusting in that fight. So as talented as he is, I think that's going to be a big problem for him in this fight as well.
Yeah, so I think a couple of things that I wanted to follow up with based on what you just said. Like that was the perfect example of what happens when you have a fighter who is a known commodity like Rick Story, but who is well coached, well trained, and eminently coachable. Like that was John Crouch doing his game plan for him there, and I think John Crouch is a highly competent coach who knows how to break down film. He knows how to train a fighter in a game plan, and that's what we saw in that fight. Is a fighter who was trained in the game plan, who knew how to respond to instruction over the course of the fight, just dismantling a guy who had no idea how to adjust. Mm-hmm. Like that's, but so you pointed to Tumanov's process orientation as being his biggest advantage here. I actually think it's what you just pointed to there. I think it's the fact that Tumanov is a highly organic fighter and does adapt really, really well over the course of the fight, that he knows how to both take advantage of openings and create those openings. That strikes me as his biggest edge over Nelson here. That Nelson is pretty shockingly fast. He hits pretty shockingly hard, and he knows how to get his body weight behind his shots. He has a really tricky shot takedown game. That is based almost entirely on timing. He doesn't do the kind of overhand right to blast double thing, but he's really good at knowing exactly when is the right time to leap in much the same way as like Georges St. Pierre credited his karate background to his blast double.
And Horiguchi has the same thing going on. These guys who are very good at timing their shots and coming in off rhythm, they tend to make actually surprisingly good surprise wrestlers.
Yeah, and I think that definitely applies to Nelson's game. And then, of course, you have the whole issue of his ground game. The problem is all of those things can be figured out. We've used this analogy before, but Nelson is a power pitcher who only has a fastball. Like that, he's going to throw as hard as he can. over and over again, and he may mix up the timing a little bit, but he doesn't have a changeup. He doesn't have a curveball. He doesn't have these different options to go to mix things up if something isn't working.
At least not in the way that Tumenov does.
No, he's not really a combination striker. He may go one punch to one kick. He may mix things up just a little bit. He'll mix up his timing on his entries, but that bodes really poorly against a guy who is as talented a counterpuncher as Tumenov is. If he can keep it out of the clinch, if he can stuff the shots, then this is Tumenov's fight to lose. It doesn't help that Nelson is tremendously hittable on the counter. Mm-hmm. Like, this is a thing that I picked up on in every one of his fights.
Yep.
When Nelson lunges in with one of those straight punches, he's just there. He doesn't necessarily get out on an angle. He doesn't even necessarily try to get out. He would rather try and work his way into the clinch then. Whereas Tumenov is a tremendous counterpuncher, and especially with his left hand. If Nelson lunges in with those rights, Tumenov is going to blast him repeatedly with his left hand.
Short aside, what happened to Rick Story?
But he was injured. I think he was booked once, but he had a long-term injury. I think now he's booked against Tarek Saffiedine, isn't he?
Oh, he is. Yeah, he was supposed to fight Eric Silva in June of 2015.
And then he was supposed to fight Eric Silva in August.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, you're right.
But the issue was that Silva couldn't get a visa for that card, and so they moved the fight to August, and then Story got injured.
All right. Not necessarily relevant, but talking about Rick Story, I remembered that I missed him because I like him. He's a fun fighter.
Yeah, he's a really fun fighter, man. He's a perfect example of what happens when you have a guy who has above average physical tools, who's ridiculously strong, and who is just coachable. Like Firas Zahabi talked about how coachable he was when they had him at TriStar.
Oh yeah, absolutely. He's got apparently he's a bit of a shit to train with, but very good fighter and very entertaining to watch. And I think, you can't talk about Gunnar Nelson without going back to that fight. I think because of the way that he was picked apart, that fight was a split decision. That's shameful. It should not have been a split decision.
There was one bullshit 48-47 card. It was like they were listening to Gooden and Hardy.
Yeah,
who had I love John Gooden and Dan Hardy, but their commentary in that fight, my God, man, you would not have known that Nelson was getting the doors blown off.
Yeah, whoever's parents live closer to London, England, they root for really hard in whatever matchup they're calling. If they have an Irish fighter against an American or Brazilian, they tend to really pick out what the Irish fighter is doing. If they have an English fighter against anyone, they have that issue. I like them too, but that fight was not that close.
Well, it was, I think one judge had, I think it was like a 50-45, 50-44, and then 48-47 Nelson.
Okay, yeah, okay.
Like, there was a 10-8. One of the judges gave a 10-8 in there, and I think that they probably all should have.
Yeah, why not? Yeah. But that match, when we saw Gunnar Nelson picked apart and everything, now I'm wondering how he will come forward after his most recent loss, which was to Damian Maia, which is a very different kind of fight. Again, he ended up being picked apart and dismantled in a brutally methodical fashion, but it was in the area that I think everyone agreed was his specialty. I mean, going into that fight, a lot of people were saying, oh, Gunnar Nelson is younger and he is a jiu-jitsu phenom. There's no way Damian Maia can just blanket him and control him. But Damian Maia is on another level with his jiu-jitsu. He was also substantially bigger and seemed a lot stronger than Gunnar Nelson in that fight. And it was the first time, quite possibly in his life, that Gunnar Nelson has been manhandled in a grappling competition, in a professional competition on the ground. And he was absolutely manhandled. He was sort of embarrassed and humiliated in that fight, and how thoroughly one-sided it was. So it's different coming back from that than it is coming back from the Rick Story loss, I think.
Well, yeah, after the Story fight, he could convince himself that, maybe had I done this differently, had I done that differently, I could have won that fight. I don't know how in the world Nelson could have looked at that Maia fight and taken any real positives from it.
He couldn't stop Maia's wrestling. He couldn't deal with him on the ground. He couldn't even come close to improving his position or escaping. He was just on the defensive the entire time. Yeah,
eventually, it was at the end of rounds, Maia would let him work a sweep, so he didn't feel too bad about himself.
Maia gave him pity sweeps. I mean, the Rick Story fight, I think the best thing you can say about the Rick Story fight is that Gunnar Nelson fought through tough moments and got to fight back consistently. He didn't even get to fight back against Damian Maia, except for when, as you point out, Damian Maia kind of seemed to let him. Maybe when he was like, all right, there's only 30 seconds left, maybe I'll snatch up a submission in transition and let him go.
Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, I think with all of this said, it's important to emphasize there are things that that Nelson does really well, but there is no reason why he has to play the game that he does with the tools that he has.
Yeah,
Like there are plenty of karate practitioners who can throw volume. There are plenty
of
of
course.
karate practitioners who can put together more than one shot at a time. There are plenty of karate practitioners who get in on one line and get out on others. Like these are not things that are endemic to his game.
You would think
know?
working with Conor McGregor as much as he does, he would have picked up some of McGregor's fondness for pressure and volume. I think those things would actually be great boons for him.
Yeah, absolutely. But maybe McGregor just doesn't spar the way that he fights. I don't know.
I've seen footage of them sparring. He looked like McGregor in there with Gunnar Nelson.
Yeah, well, yeah, I don't know why he hasn't picked that up then. But so Nelson is a surprisingly strong clinch fighter. What was really shocking to me when I met Gunnar Nelson at the media day before UFC 194 is how small he is. He is not a welterweight. He really genuinely is not a welterweight. He's listed at I think 5'11". I think he's probably about 5'9" and a half. It looked to me like he was about 175 or 180 pounds, maybe. Like the dude is a lightweight.
And I've seen him sparring with McGregor. I don't think he's actually substantially larger than the featherweight champion.
He's a little bigger through the hips and the waist,
Yeah.
but he is not a welterweight. Not as welterweight is currently constructed.
Yeah. And how sizable is Tumenov, do you think, as a welterweight?
I think Tumenov is legitimately 5'11" and probably walks around at 185 or 190. I think he's about an average sized welterweight.
Yeah.
But so at the end of the day, Tumenov is a really good defensive wrestler. We know this. The only guy that he's given up takedowns to in the UFC is Ildemar Alcantara, who was cutting from somewhere like 205 or 210 to get down to 170 in Tumenov's debut when he was a callow 22-year-old. Nelson is not a world class takedown artist. He's a surprisingly good wrestler, but I don't think anybody's going to call him an elite one. If this turns into a striking match, as it probably will, Tumenov is going to murder him. That's kind of my read on this fight.
Yeah, it kind of feels like it. It's, Tumenov has the volume. He's got good defense. I think maybe actually it's not necessarily the biggest advantage because Gunnar Nelson himself is a pretty good phase-shifting fighter when he can get you to react to him. But I think the fact that Tumenov is not only more process-driven but better at adapting on the fly, a more organic fighter in combinations and in the little spaces and phases between ranges, spaces and moments between ranges and between phases, between elevations. I think that makes him especially dangerous for Gunnar Nelson because Nelson is not a great defensive fighter. He doesn't throw a lot of volume, and he can't demand your respect on the feet the way other fighters can. And so if Tumenov gets inside, the willingness with which he changes up the rhythms and trajectories and targets of his attacks is going to be very, very difficult. He's kind of on the feet. He's kind of Rick Story times 10. You know what I mean? He's like Rick Story with more speed and more power and a wider array of attacks. Who strings them together even better than Rick Story does. I
mean, I think he has a good case to make as one of the 2 or 3 best pure boxers in that division.
Sure, yeah.
He does an excellent job of probing with his jab and using his jab to set other things up. He's got a murderous left hook. He mixes things up to the head and body. He flurries in combination. Basically, Tumenov has 2 different striking games that he uses depending on where he is in the cage. And that's just the level that he's working at is so much different and so much higher. Out in open space, Tumenov is a counterpuncher. Mm-hmm. If you give him space, if you try and leap in at him with shots, he's going to probe with his jab to try and draw out a reaction. Then when you come at him, he's going to counterpunch. He's going to flurry on the counter. But then at the same time, he's using small steps, really good, clean footwork to back you up to the fence. And when your back hits the fence, that's when Tumenov really flurries. And he puts together really nice kicks on the ends of his punching combinations. He mixes things up. At that point, that's when Tumenov is really, really dangerous. But so he has 2 different ways of being extremely dangerous, both of which are problems for a fighter who who wants to do the things that Gunnar Nelson wants to do.
Yeah, and you could imagine maybe Gunnar Nelson doing some of what Lorenz Larkin managed to do, using a kick-heavy game. But it's just, thing is, Gunnar Nelson, proud of the fact that he doesn't make changes for each opponent that he faces. Potentially has his confidence severely damaged from his last fight. It's just difficult to imagine him coming in with anything revolutionary, anything different from what he showed before, any kind of market increase in volume or a change in the kinds of targets that he likes to attack. It's just going to be Gunnar Nelson going in there and doing Gunnar Nelson, I think. And Gunnar Nelson's a good fighter. That guy is a dangerous fighter. He's very talented. He's got a lot of skills. He's well-rounded in a way. But against somebody who is as determined and focused and poised as Albert Tumenov, and as flexible in from one moment to the next, I think it's a really difficult matchup for the Icelandian. Is that what you call someone from Iceland?
Icelander?
That's what I first wanted to say, but it didn't sound right.
I think it's Icelander.
The Icelandikian. I'm assuming he's from Reykjavik. Is that where everyone from Iceland is from?
Pretty much, yeah. I'm pretty sure it's Icelander.
Okay, Icelander. There we go. A tough matchup for the Icelander. That was the most succinct way I could think of to end that point, just by asking a question and undermining the gravitas of it all right afterward. So, I think that's about it on this fight. Looking forward to it, but I am going to probably put a little bit of money on Tumenov because it's hard for me to imagine Gunnar Nelson having any kind of consistent way to win it. So when we come back, we're going to answer a topic request from one of you, our Patreon patrons, and that should be a good one. So join us after this break for some of that. Financial support is fantastic, but there are other, even easier ways to support Heavy Hands. Perhaps the best is by spreading the word. We know our fan base. You're all cool, popular people with serious social media presences. You're tastemakers and trendsetters. Okay, there are one or two of you that don't fit that description. You know who you are, but no matter what, you can always help us out by telling folks about the show. And you can also give us a positive rating and review on iTunes and Stitcher, things like that. We rely on word of mouth and positive feedback to grow and improve, so thank you very much for your time and your help. Now, back to the show. And we are back for our final segment. I said we were going to answer a topic suggestion. If you pledge $20 to Heavy Hands on Patreon, you too can have a full 15 to 20 minute topic of your choice addressed on the show. And we are doing that today for a kind and generous man known only as Ricky. And Ricky asks, he kind of has a statement first. So Ricky says, I appreciate slick fighters and their priority to not get hit cleanly or at all. Are there different styles of slick fighters, such as slick outboxers or slick counterfighters? Those seem to stand out as two possibilities to me. Slick boxer punchers? What do you think? So I think before we address this, we should maybe talk about what makes a fighter a slick fighter.
Yeah, so I think that there are basically two components to being a slick fighter as we understand the term to apply in boxing. And that is, first and foremost, defensive acumen and skill, being hard to hit cleanly, having a variety of defensive tools at your disposal, not just one layer of head movement or parries or blocks, but having all those layers working together in concert to create a total defensive package. But the second is charisma and swagger, and the ability to not only do those things, but to impress upon the crowd, to impress upon the judges that what you are doing is meaningful. Basically, to create the impression that your defense is scoring. If that makes sense.
Yeah, I can't ever. It's one of my most one of the topics that interests me most, and one that I cannot manage to discuss without upsetting or offending people when I talk about the art of bullshit. And to a large degree, that's what being a slick fighter is not just being a great defensive fighter. Like, for example, Roberto Duran, great defensive fighter. Fantastic defense, very, very difficult to hit cleanly. And while people acknowledge that, I wouldn't call Roberto Duran a slick fighter by this metric, because he wasn't a very good bullshitter. Roberto Duran often made you miss by so little that it was difficult to tell whether you had landed or not. So he wasn't always doing he was always in there to land the counter or to break your confidence and to hurt you in response to what you failed to hit him with. And great bullshitters, and if that is, we agree, a quality of slicksters, great slicksters are very often trying to kind of do the opposite. They're not necessarily trying to be as effective as possible. They're trying to look as effective as possible. And looking effective for these fighters is often more important than being effective.
Yeah, and that's not to say that it isn't an effective tactic overall.
No, of course not.
And I'm not saying that you were suggesting it, but there is a great value to the art of bullshit. And like, if you look like you're winning, chances are you are winning.
Sure, and if you get the opponent to buy into this impression, or the judges, or the audience, whatever, you are going to be able to increase your chances of actually winning the fight. You know, and this is why I always get into trouble when I talk about this, because I say, oh, they look more effective than they are, and so you're saying they're ineffective, like they didn't deserve to win. I'm like, as much as I try to see through bullshit tactics and slickster tactics, I try to ignore them, to my detriment sometimes, where I will really discount a defensive fighter in favor of an aggressive one, just because I think they're not landing as much as they really are. I acknowledge that it's... What's that?
There was a boxing fight that you and I were talking about that embodied this perfectly. Was it Lamont Peterson against
Danny Garcia? Yeah.
Yeah, that was exactly the fight.
Yep. Lamont Peterson doing very little of actual import in the first 7 rounds. He had some great moments late in the fight, but spent more than the first half of the entire fight really just trying to look cool. And most people, I would say, went for it. Most people thought he dominated the fight. And I didn't think so.
But he didn't actually do anything.
Not much. No, he jabbed and he glanced or missed while Garcia went to his body and did things that weren't flashy. You know, Danny Garcia is a very workmanlike fighter. He does things because they are good boxing, not because they look like good boxing. And so when he's in there hitting the body with straight right hands and jabs, jabbing Peterson to the chest, these are tactics that nobody gives a shit about. Nobody gives a shit about a body jab unless it's one from Kovalev or Mayweather, because those look big. And most people just say, okay, jabs. Bernard Hopkins, when he fought Beibut Shumenov, he got hit in the chest by about a dozen jabs per round in the first 4 rounds. I gave a great many of those rounds to Shumenov, and people thought I was crazy. But it's because those things are supposed to count. It's just that if you give this great, powerful impression, either to the opponent or to the judges and the audience, that what is happening does or doesn't count as much as it really does, if you're boosting the appearance of your own tactics, that is genuinely effective. It's very difficult to watch a fight without buying into a narrative. And so slick fighters are often the ones who, through actual defensive craft, combined with swagger and confidence and charisma, can create a powerful narrative that it's difficult for either you or the judge or the opponent to see through.
Yeah, and this is an incredible feat to be able to pull this off.
Oh, yeah.
But there are not many fighters in MMA who have both of those things. That's like, Connor, as you and I were discussing this beforehand and trying to figure out our definitions and how we were going to approach this, I think that was what stood out to me most. There are defensively sound fighters in MMA, even defensively slick fighters in MMA. There are fighters who have a lot of swagger and a lot of confidence in MMA. There's not a lot of overlap between those two categories.
Yeah.
So I think the quintessential example that you raised was Benson Henderson, right?
Sure.
Who is a master of the art of bullshit in a fight, which has led to him getting a lot of decisions that a lot of people, not necessarily myself, didn't think that he deserved to get.
Mm-hmm.
But he is really, really good at conveying the impression that he's the one who's winning the fight, at no-selling shots, at making what he's doing look impressive. Like, he's really good at that.
Yeah, Ben Henderson's actually sneakily good on the defense. Better, I think, than people realize he is, but he's even better at making it look like he's unaffected by shots that do or don't land. Like, he's better at selling his defense than he is, I think, at actually being defensive, even though he is pretty good defensively. He's particularly good at selling his own shots as opposed to yours when you're fighting him. You saw this a lot, say, when, like in his first fight with Anthony Pettis. How impactful Ben Henderson's kicks always seem. When has Ben Henderson actually really, really damaged somebody with a kick?
Nate Diaz, and I think that's it.
Yeah, not many. A lot of leg kicks, a lot of body kicks, but they always look huge. They look massive. And yet when Ben Henderson gets hit, he is very, very good at walking it off. He's constantly caught up and fixing his hair. and he has a completely impassive expression on his face, kind of this focused impassiveness. He's got his kind of crazy eyes, but he never really betrays that he's hurt. I mean, shit, I think there are a lot of fighters who would have looked a lot worse given the body kick assault that Anthony Pettis landed on him in their rematch. And Henderson was backing off. He clearly had to adapt and do something, but he did not once really show an expression of pain or appear to be hurt the way other fighters would.
I was going to say that's one of two examples that I can think of in pretty much in Henderson's entire career, where he has like admitted that he was hurt by a shot. You know, the other was when Rafael dos Anjos literally dropped him. You know, this narrative changes a little bit now that we just saw Andrei Koreshkov like damn near take years off his life in the cage.
Yeah, I think that's a really valuable fight, because I think when we have fighters who get by on being slick fighters, when we actually see them lose, it often is shockingly one-sided. Like when Anderson Silva lost to Chris Weidman, or when Ben Henderson lost to Koreshkov or to Dos Anjos. You know, when they have these guys fight opponents who don't buy into these impressions and who stick to a very clear process, a very clear strategy, then all of the holes that this slickster style is kind of intended to cover up, especially if it's a fighter who really relies on it, they become gaping and obvious. You know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, you know, it's interesting that Floyd Mayweather never ran into somebody who could make him do that.
It's astounding that he never did. And I think I think too, like Floyd Mayweather, is remarkably good in terms of skill. You know, so it's not just
preternaturally good.
Yeah, like, he's an obscenely good fighter. So it's not just like Floyd Mayweather, and the same with like Bernard Hopkins. But Bernard Hopkins fighting into older age and fighting arguably some more dangerous opponents, and probably not actually being as much of a fighter as Floyd Mayweather, you know, not being as gutsy in his performances, more concerned with protecting himself. Bernard Hopkins is a great example of a fighter who ran into those problems. Bernard Hopkins has been made to look very underwhelming in some of his fights, and then he's been able to look much better than you could ever imagine he would in other matchups, especially when he's old. It just really depends on how the opponent reacts to the swagger, how the opponent reacts to the confidence, and if it breaks their confidence when they not only can't hit the person, but every time they miss, they get hit with a sharp timed counter and the other guy sticks their tongue out, or when they do land, they feel like they're not having any kind of effect. It takes a special fighter to stand up to this kind of showmanship, which is really what it is, and pick the fighter apart, you know?
Yeah, but so like that's interesting that we talk about how to defeat swagger as just not how to defeat a slickster as just not buying into it, and isn't that essentially what we've talked about with the travails of Anthony Pettis in the recent past? That the guys that have beaten him have just not given a shit about his aura. Yeah, you know,
because Anthony Pettis has relied heavily on his opponents respecting what he has to offer. You know, even when they fight with the right game plan, like Gilbert Melendez did, Melendez exhausted himself because he was so worried about what Pettis was going to do back to him, and kept getting tagged with counters and stuff like that. And so he was dead tired by the time I think that fight actually finished. And Pettis stays remarkably composed and cool in these fights, and he relies on the fact that his opponent is not going to do the same. And all three of the last three guys who beat him, they were cool as a cucumber. Rafael dos Anjos, Eddie Alvarez, and Edson Barboza, possibly most of all, were just composed and not necessarily workmanlike, but they just went in there and got the job done. They treated it like a sports competition rather than a fight.
Yeah, exactly. So it's interesting. It's an interesting kind of issue. But so I want to come back to the other side of this, which is defensive acumen.
Yeah.
In MMA, as we've discussed many times, you have so many different things that you have to learn that it is very difficult to learn the kinds of elite defensive skills that boxers pick up, because you just don't have the time to work on this over and over and over again. So when we see defensively slick fighters in MMA, they tend to be guys who are closer to the end of their careers. Like
Sure.
the example that I always use of this is Jose Aldo, who I think is the most defensively sound all-around fighter in MMA history. When you look at Jose Aldo's last fight before he got into the WEC against Shoji Maruyama, it is shocking how much this unknown, unheralded Japanese fighter is hitting the great Jose Aldo.
Yeah. You pointed this out to me recently, and it's like, it's not the same. And it actually was the case before Jose Aldo became WC champion in general. He was surprisingly hittable. I mean, I remember his fight with, who was the guy that he knocked out with the counter knee to the body jab? It was a Hispanic name.
Was it Rolando Perez?
It was Rolando Perez. Rolando Perez went in for a body jab and got countered with the knee. Perez hit Aldo a lot in that fight. He landed a lot of jabs and right hands. He didn't land as many as the commentators thought he was, but he landed some good shots. And that doesn't really happen in Aldo fights anymore, which is why it was so stunning to see what happened against Conor McGregor. He got hit with the third punch of the fight. He's very, very difficult to hit cleanly, and he hasn't always been that way. It's almost like he made the transition from being a fighter who was like Anthony Pettis, that form of swagger where he's going to like force you to back down by being faster and flashier and more dangerous than you, to being a fighter who developed enough defensive acumen where now he can actually make you as ineffective as you used to feel you were.
So this was my theory, and you were not necessarily on board with this about Georges St. Pierre. That I think that is effectively the transformation that Georges St. Pierre made over the course of his career, where when he was a young guy, he was full of swagger and he did lots of crazy things, and he threw spinning back kicks and he threw these ridiculously hard right hands, and he did a lot of shit that played off his prodigious athleticism and really relied on you respecting his game. And then there was a point after he lost to Matt Serra and as he got a little bit older and as the injuries piled up, where he became a much more workmanlike fighter. Where he had all of those, like he was always a defensively sound fighter. He always did those things well, but he replaced the swagger with just technical soundness.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I see what you're saying more now than I did when you first mentioned his name, because, if you think of Georges St. Pierre alongside the classic slick fighters of boxing fame, he doesn't have a lot of those traits. He's not a very layered defensive fighter. That was a problem for him in a lot of his later fights. But if you look at the poise and the control with which Georges St. Pierre, because it can't, slicksters in MMA won't be exactly the same as they were in boxing. I think that's the real thing here that makes it difficult to assess who are the slick fighters of MMA and what styles can they fall into and so on and so forth, because there's a very specific culture in boxing that led to the predominance of what we now call slick boxers. They're largely black fighters, like the Black Murderers Row of boxers who fought in the 20s, 30s, and 40s, fighters who fought each other over and over and over because the white champions would not fight them, and they got into all these gym wars, and they would just travel around and be real journeymen and fight once every week or once every 2 weeks. And so they were forced to develop a style that allowed them to befuddle opponents, that allowed them to protect themselves even when they hadn't really had time to prepare for a specific opponent, and allowed them to adjust and allowed them to convince the local judges that they were winning the fight even when they were still in the process of working out what exactly was happening to them. And that's kind of the American tradition of slick boxers. And that's not really the circumstance in MMA. We don't necessarily have that demographic fully represented the way it is in boxing. And MMA is not old enough yet to have developed this kind of proud tradition of great defensive adaptive fighting. It would be like saying who are the slick boxers in boxing in 1890. The schools probably haven't developed to that degree yet to actually find those fighters.
Yeah, and there's no reason why that can't happen. It's just that I like the point that you made, Connor, that points to those things in boxing coming out of very specific cultural contexts, cultural and physical contexts, and that leading to a particular style of training fighters, that the tricks that you pick up when that's the way you fight can then be taught in gyms over and over and over and over again. But the argument that comes in large part from, it's Charles Farrell, right, who wrote that piece for Deadspin?
Yes, Charles Farrell, who managed, who did he manage back in the day? Who fought Rafael Marquez, a great slick fighter.
Oh God,
I'll look it up while you talk.
Yeah, at any rate, he published this great article for Deadspin. If you haven't read it, I highly recommend it. But his argument is basically that this school of boxing in the United States is more or less dying out. I'm not sure that, I think maybe in the direct lineage it is, but the tradition and what it plays off of in the audience's mind and the judge's mind is not necessarily so. He pointed to Floyd Mayweather as the last of these fighters.
And I think he's romanticizing it a bit. I think, of course, we still have fighters from that tradition. You know, like I think you could call Terrence Crawford the slick black American boxer archetype. We still have them. Tim Bradley. Floyd Mayweather's not the last. The guy that Charles Farrell managed, by the way, was Freddie Norwood, one of the most avoided boxers of the 90s. A very, very good, very slick fighter. He beat Juan Manuel Marquez. It's probably his best win. But, you know, I don't necessarily agree with Mr. Farrell's assessment of like where the style is going, but it is a great read to see what it came from. And to understand, you know, what was the environment in which it sprouted, and maybe how you should define it. But I think that is the best example of that's the best way to summarize the group of fighters that we think of as slick when we talk about slick boxers. And MMA still doesn't have a ton of them. Maybe it'll be guys like Stephen Thompson and like Michael Page, like these guys from point fighting backgrounds who come into MMA and they become the slick fighters of the future.
What's fascinating to me about Stephen Thompson, because I thought of him earlier as we were having this discussion, is that he is a slick fighter without swagger. Like, I don't think he has any real swagger to him. And maybe it's just because like his caucasity levels are off the charts.
He's among the whitest fighters in the UFC. He doesn't.
I mean, literally, the man is an eggshell.
Yeah, he doesn't make a point of. I think he's almost more humiliating a fight because he doesn't make a point of playing up how thoroughly he humiliates you. Like, he will slap you in the face with the sole of his foot just to make you look silly. With like a powerless kick, he will just smack you on the lips. Mm-hmm. And that's embarrassing. And maybe it's the fact that he just works off of that almost makes him have an effortless swagger.
Yeah, should we like start thinking of Stephen Thompson in that regard? I don't know. Maybe he is, and it's just never occurred to me to think of him as a swaggering fighter.
He doesn't have the kind of swag we're used to seeing in boxing. That's why, you know, he doesn't have this like over the top bravado to his style, but he's pretty slick. The other guy,
maybe that's where MMA swagger is going. We understated also, swagger.
Well, maybe then this guy falls into that group as well. We have to at least mention his name before we wrap up. And I think Dominic Cruz is maybe the best example of a slick fighter in MMA today, especially given how much more depth he has added to his not only his bullshitting abilities, but his genuine defensive skill and the ability, the deftness with which he puts his punches together. Dominic Cruz continues to improve and is just a nightmare of a fighter to find yourself matched up with, because he is like a Floyd Mayweather. He's a slick fighter who backs it up with tons of real depth of skill. So thank you very much, Ricky, for your question. We hope we answered it to your satisfaction, or at least danced around it to your satisfaction. That's what we kind of like to do with these topic suggestions, is just see where the idea takes us and let it be kind of a free-form discussion. And slicksters, man, you got to love them. And I hope we see more of them in MMA and maybe discover what their background will be and I don't know, find out what the slickster in MMA really looks like as the sport continues to develop. So that about does it for today's episode. Like I said, later in the week, I think we're definitely talking to Brandon Gibson later in the week, right? That's scheduled.
As far as I know, we are set to do that.
Okay.
Though, you know, like
Things
at
fall
this point, if these dates are not held, it is not on Connor and I.
Yeah, that's true. We try. So hopefully next episode this week, coming on Thursday, I believe, will be with Brandon Gibson and Mark Henry, the UFC 197 Winners Circle. And Pat, you got anything coming out this week that people should know about?
I have a preview of Sunday's UFC Rotterdam card coming out on Bleacher Report. Then I have, what else am I doing? I think I'm doing something on Anderson Silva for the Washington Post. And then cool. I think I'm just participating in our rankings panels on Bleacher Report this week. I don't think I'm writing another piece.
All right. I also have my preview of UFC Rotterdam coming out on SureDog.com. Couple things in the works for Bloody Elbow. I'm not actually sure which will be coming out. I'm so much worse at promoting things than you because you always have this concrete idea of what you're doing. I'm a seat in my pants kind of guy when it comes to these articles.
Well,
but
I look forward to when I'm done revising my dissertation in a few weeks, being able to just like fly by the seat of my pants a little more, because right now I have to sit down on Sunday morning and figure out exactly what my schedule is going to be for the week and when I'm going to slot everything in.
Yeah, well, I'm looking forward to you joining me in the land of the unorganized.
I'm a naturally disorganized person. This is not natural for me. I don't like this.
I've got a video on Sam Langford in the works, and I was thinking about doing a piece on the art of bullshit because of a fight that happened last weekend that kind of exemplifies it in action. I don't know. Things. Maybe something on Albert Tumanov. Something will be happening besides my preview this week. And probably 2 pieces for Bloody Elbow, so keep an eye out for those. And maybe I'll be able to promote them a little better on the second episode of Heavy Hands this week. But other than that, we will see you again later this week. Thank you for listening. If you came here today for the finer points of face punching, you came to the right place. This has been Heavy Hands.